Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? Our program is about to resume. Please take your seats. Once again, our program is about to resume. Please take your seats. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Jim Trogdon.
Well, I hope everyone has enjoyed the morning so far, but before we began the next session, I thought it would be a great opportunity to spend a few minutes discussing this past year, and by the time I get through, you'll understand why it's critically important. There's simply no way that we can welcome the next panel without setting the stage properly. Last year was a great year for us with great successes, but also great challenges. We went from what seemed to be our greatest of times at $8 billion in active construction projects compared to $4 billion, responding to disasters in weeks instead of months, and decreasing our project development times by 70%. And passage of the Build-NC first transportation bond in our state since 1996. And then it seemed like we had to slam on brakes. But while that seemed to surprise some, it should not have. Since February of 2019, we have been working with our General Assembly on recommendations to help improve our cash challenges, and each month bringing increasing urgency. When I returned to NCDOT in January 2017, we certainly had a delivery problem which resulted in $2.2 billion in accumulated cash. Everyone agreed that we had to deliver the projects in North Carolina that people need, want, and have been, in many cases, waiting for decades. We're one of the fastest growing states in the nation in real growth, and certainly every year growing faster than the states of New York, New Jersey, Ohio, Illinois, and Michigan combined. So if you don't believe that transportation is important, just do nothing and you'll see, because our predictions are that the delays that we have today will only grow by 216% over the next 20 years if we do nothing different. And based on Tony's predictions, I need to add 50% more to that. So to solve this problem, we improved internal processes, reduced our project development times by 70%, and got projects ready to be delivered. We were achieving our targeted delivery levels of $3 billion annually, which was a 100% increase, which would have kept us around $750 million in our mandated cash range. And in 2019, we delivered major projects like the first 20 miles of improvement on I-95 has been awarded near Fayetteville, bringing it up to modern standards, and the first widening of that facility since it was originally constructed, constructing the Havelock Bypass and improving US 70 to I-42 standards with upgrades around US 70 at James City, as well as constructing and awarding the project for the Rockingham Bypass, which connects US 220 and US 74. Building new sections, which was a major effort this last year to complete 540 and extend the Triangle Expressway over to I-40. And as many of you witnessed coming in this morning, the construction on I-440 improvements, which we anticipate will be completed in 2023, as well as across the state, improvements on I-485, and one that folks have been waiting again for decades, the first widening of I-26 in Henderson and Buncombe counties in its history. So then a multitude of different influencers became clear to us. The cost of restoring mobility following natural disasters changed from our normal average historically over the previous 10 years of $66 million a year to over $300 million this last year. Simultaneously, the cost of settling our MAP Act cases, which were critical to delivery of our projects that we had already awarded and limited to future states' exposure, grew from nearly zero to $400 million last year. So the confluence of all those things, it became crystal clear to us and members at DOT, as well as our members at the General Assembly, that our mandated spending mechanisms and our processes that we had for budgeting and programming for disasters no longer can handle the current and modern demands that we're seeing today and potentially in the future. We had no way of paying for storms without impacting other programs. So to put it bluntly, if we deliver all of our programs on budget and then have to respond to growing disasters today and in the future, we would always be falling below our mandated minimums. The two largest impacts, as I said, were storms and MAP Act, which must be paid for out of transportation funds. We have no other sources available to us. And so the impact in 2019 was slightly over $700 million in unanticipated spending in just that year alone. So we were forced to take steps, the only ones that we can take, which is how do we reduce future work and future spending. We have weathered this past year, and at the end of the calendar year, the General Assembly passed Senate Bill 356, which will help us mitigate some of these factors. But with the current physical structure today, we cannot return to the same level of activities that we had in 2018 without significant influx in funds, primarily in our operations and maintenance accounts. We will be delivering over $200 billion in capital projects this year through Garvey and Build NC and our traditional federal funding. However, our financial targets and our mechanisms that are mandated that have worked in the past, we do not see in the near term working in the future. That's why the General Assembly took the action with Senate Bill 356 and made the first steps to create a savings reserve for us because our old systems were just outdated. So you can imagine if our short-term storm response systems were outdated and we need to change, what would happen in the next decade if we're completely unprepared for what you just heard? It would make 2019 look like a really easy year for this transportation industry in North Carolina. Therefore, that's why the NC First Commission is so critical. Today, our investment strategies, we know, need updating and will soon be out of date for the future. How do we prepare for this future? How do we ensure that we're able to invest in a transportation network for all modes and all needs and maintain the quality of life or improve it, as well as improve our economic competitiveness? These are serious questions for the NC First Commission that must be addressed. And so at this time, I'd like to ask Tony Lathrop to come to the podium, and he'll introduce our distinguished panel.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate so much your leadership as Finance Chair of the Board of Transportation. I've been fortunate to work closely with General Trogdon and his team, and they are just doing great things. Before I bring out the next panel, we have another audience poll question. If you could please take a moment to answer this question. It's flashing up there. And I'm not as intuitive with the apps, so I'll tell you, go to the schedule section on the app and then go to the general session piece of the schedule, click on that, then go down, scroll down to the bottom, and you will see the poll question down there to click on. All righty, I'm going to keep moving. A few quick points about the NC First Commission. It was created in March of last year, and there are 14 people on the NC First Commission, a diverse group of individuals with expertise in finance, business, and public policy who are tasked with utilizing data to develop a long-range transportation investment strategy for North Carolina. The Commission has held meetings over the past year, collected thousands of pages of data for study and consideration, have heard from experts, and learned about how the funding of NCDOT works. After the Commission develops and presents its recommendations, there's going to be more work to do. For if the recommendations are truly forward-thinking and bold, the public has to be engaged in a meaningful way to embrace this change. So how do we do that? What challenges will the commission and the stakeholders have in communicating and educating folks about this? How do you build a coalition of supporters around a concept that is new to discuss the issues at hand relating to that and to offer insight into how the NC First Commission might face this final stage of its work? We've asked a well-known and respected group of North Carolinians who've successfully done this to come today to offer their thoughts and advice. First, to facilitate this discussion, we have the co-chairs of the NC First Commission with us today. And at this time, I'd like to welcome those two co-chairs to the stage, Nancy McFarland and Ward Nye. Nancy, as most of you know, is the former mayor of the city of Raleigh and a successful businesswoman. And Ward is the CEO of Martin Marietta here in North Carolina. As an advisory member myself of the NC First Commission with Secretary Trogdon, I have been able to see firsthand Ward and Nancy's leadership over the past year and feel fortunate and privileged to have them in that role, and it's been a real pleasure to work with them. So Ward and Nancy will be your moderators as our next guests discuss building coalitions and enacting positive change. The first member of our group is the Honorable James B. Hunt. Governor Hunt served a historic 4 terms as the governor of North Carolina. Today, he chairs the Hunt Institute, an affiliate of the Duke University Sanford School of Public Policy. The Hunt Institute works with current and emerging political, business, and education leaders on a national level to improve public education. Many years ago, I was privileged to have Governor Hunt as my first boss, so it's a pleasure to come full circle today and introduce him. I could take an hour and just scratch the surface of his impact on North Carolina and the United States. I'll just say that he's not just the greatest governor of North Carolina, but one of the greatest governors ever in the history of the United States, in my personal opinion. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable James B. Hunt.
Well, you're kind. I'm already out here. Thank you. You're kind. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you. Also joining us is Anita Brown-Graham to offer her perspective not only as a member of the UNC School of Government faculty, but also as the former executive director of the Institute for Emerging Issues. Anita is also the leader of NC Impact, a special initiative that seeks to expand the UNC School of Government's ability to work with public officials on complex policy issues ranging from economic mobility to opioid abuse. Welcome, Anita. In addition, we are very fortunate to have retired Army General Dan McNeil with us today to offer a perspective from the national and international level. General McNeil is a retired 4-star general who served, I should say, in the past, as a commander of the coalition forces in Afghanistan and as the commanding general of the U.S. Army Forces Command. Welcome, General McNeil.
General.
And at this time, I'm going to turn the panel over to our moderators, Nancy McFarland and Ward Nye. Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Tony, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And a thanks to Secretary Trogdon and his entire team, who have put a lot of work into what we think you've already seen as a very special conference, and I'm sure that it will be. The initial presentation that we saw today was somewhere between exciting on one end and sobering on the other. And as we sit here, Nancy and I get to bookend this panel, we find this actually humbling because this is an incredible group of people, and I think you'll enjoy a conversation that we will try to lead with them for the next 4 or 5 hours. I'm kidding. But I do think you will very much enjoy the dialogue that we'll have today. And with that, I know Nancy has some preliminary questions she'd like to turn to.
Right, and thank you very much, Ward. Ward and I are both very excited about our work on the NC First Commission and look forward to hearing some advice from our panel here. But I want to, before we start, ask if any of the speakers has an opening remark they'd like to make. Gov?
Well, first of all, it's great to be back in this great auditorium where we had the Emerging Issues Forum for so many years. We had come here, General and I, big NC State graduates, and we were thinking about all the good ideas that we brought to North Carolina to build this state. We've done great things. Governor Roy Cooper's working on those now. General Trogdon and this transportation leadership is working on it now, and we've just been seeing all this stuff. Boy, it got me excited, but it made me think about how we in North Carolina over the years, historically, have seen what the situation is, what the possibilities are, and we have gotten ideas and we have gone out there and found ways to put them into place and succeed. North Carolina is one of the fastest growing states in America. It's got great future possibilities, but we have to deal with transportation. And the thought occurred to me that when Governor Jim Holzhauser, great Republican governor, and I worked together, when we found that our children were not getting the kind of start and doing what they needed to do in education, North Carolina, this is, y'all are young people, but North Carolina did not have public school kindergartens. I mentioned this to a group of NC State students the other day, General, and they didn't believe it. I said, well, let me tell you, you didn't have it until some of us put it in. Governor Holzhauser and I both ran on a platform of putting in public school kindergarten. It took money to do it. We saw the need, we saw what we would get from it, better education, better economy, all of that, better families, and we went out and did it. There are a lot of legislators here today that are going to need to put resources into transportation. We can do it. We can make it economical. And by the way, it can save lives as we learned today. So I would just want to say, this is a great thing. This is exciting. And let's grab it in North Carolina.
Thank you very much, Governor. Thank you. Did anyone else?
I'll make 2 points, Mayor. To me, they're the most important things I can say. And the first is, if you're in the HR business in your firm, hire a veteran if you get a chance. If not a veteran, at least a member of a soldier's family who's serving in the great state of North Carolina. And the second point is, before I leave today, I'm going to encourage Secretary Trogdon that perhaps the Board of Transportation of North Carolina ought to have a couple of advisory members or ex officio members, and they would be the garrison commanders at Fort Bragg and Camp Lejeune. If you ask the governor's office, they'll tell you that 10% of the North Carolina economy are defense dollars. That's rather significant.
Right.
And there's very few things that you can do in transportation in the great state of North Carolina that will not have an effect on the defense establishment of this country. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Just a couple of comments to both echo what has been said and maybe put an exclamation mark on the salience of this conversation. Clearly, the topics that our keynote speaker raised are top of mind for those of you who are in the audience. But I want to tell you that they're top of mind for people all over North Carolina. As you heard in the introduction, I run the NC Impact Initiative at the UNC School of Government. And one of the things we do is work with state and local government leaders to help them with complex challenges. For the last 6 months, I've been working with the North Carolina Department of Commerce, supporting their effort to develop a new 4-year strategic, comprehensive economic development plan for the state of North Carolina. I spent all fall doing listening tours and focus groups in each of the 8 economic prosperity zones. And I will tell you that in every one of those conversations, transportation was an important piece of what people said they needed for their region to move forward. In fact, by the time I got to the 4th of those regional convenings, I was thinking, man, Secretary Copeland at Commerce should have gotten Trogdon to put some money into this, because I'm spending a lot of my time talking about transportation. The reality is, when we ask people to prioritize the top 6 things that they thought they needed for their regions to reach their economic potential, in fully 50% of the regions, transportation that was accessible, coordinated, and affordable rose to the top of the list. So kudos to the organizers of this conference, because I think North Carolina is absolutely ready to have this conversation.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So let's open up with a question for all of you. As we heard from Mr. Seba, the way we move goods and people is evolving. So what's your advice on how to plan for a rapidly changing environment? And let's start with Governor Hunt.
Well, I think, first of all, we want to ask people what they want. And what I found in my years of leadership is that they want jobs, they want opportunities for their families, they want a good education for their children, and by the way, they'd like for them to have jobs in North Carolina. I don't know about you all, but Carolyn Hunt and I are seeing our grandchildren now want to move to New York City and Seattle, Washington, and Los Angeles because of those great jobs out there, using a lot of this technology we've seen here today. Well, that's fine, and a lot of that will happen. But I want it to happen here in North Carolina, which means we've got to do the things that are required to attract these companies, to develop our new ones. Let me say this to you all. When I was first governor, and I was elected governor in 1976, the same year Jimmy Carter was elected governor, president. That year, North Carolina was doing pretty good, but we weren't doing nearly as well as we needed to do. And I remember that in those first years, we were doing what we could to improve transportation. In those days, it was a matter of just putting, maybe some more road tax on so that we could pave roads. You're looking at a guy who saw his country road paved back when I was a boy. In those days, General, you don't go quite that far back, but you remember it. You've heard it.
I can remember the dirt road next to my house growing up being paved, Governor.
Right. Well, we paved those roads. The people said we want to pave them. We'll put some tax money in there to do that, and that paid off for us. And then we put in these interstates, or these primary highways. And I remember when I was elected, I guess that first time as governor, I asked Tom Bradshaw, who was the mayor of Raleigh at that time, they'd put in an interstate system, but North Carolina did not have a connection between the capital city and our port in Wilmington. We were the only state in America that left all their ports off the interstate system. And I said, Tom, go to Washington, get the money for an interstate highway from Raleigh to Wilmington, and don't come home till you do. Well, he didn't come home, and he got it. My point simply is this. We've got to do some big things now, folks. You've seen all this stuff today. You've seen how it makes sense economically. I think it makes sense in terms of our families and so forth. And so I would hope that out of this, that we would respond to our governor who's thinking about all of this. He appointed all these people, by the way, who are leading this today. This great secretary, Jim Trogdon, all these board members and you all, I hope today we will leave here saying, boy, I learned a lot. I learned a lot about how we can do this, what it's going to take, and what it will mean to our families. But that we will do whatever it takes to find the resources. You're going to develop a plan now, but then we have to find the resources to invest in that and to make that happen, just like we've always invested in our military. Thank God for the United States military that protects America. Some people don't understand. I know what it does. It saved us during World War II. Hitler would have taken us. I know this sounds like ancient history to some of you. It's not. You have to see the big picture, see what you have to do to invest and to have a good life, and transportation now is increasingly one of the biggest things we've got to do.
Thank you, Governor. General, what's your advice on how to plan for a rapidly changing environment?
Well, I think you have to work hard at informing the majority of the public of the great state of North Carolina. And let's take, for example, one of the things we heard today, and that's about autonomous cars. I'm reminded of going through parachute training. When I was a young lieutenant in January of 1969, and the day that it came after a couple of weeks of training, we hit what was called jump week, and you were going to have to make your 5 qualifying parachute jumps. I can remember all that morning as we're going through the pre-jump training, as we're going through shooting up in the parachute, as we're getting into that ancient C-119 aircraft, and it rumbled and smoked down the runway. The whole time I was saying to myself, this isn't going to happen. This is part of the training. And the next realization I had was impacting Fryer Drop Zone on the other side of the river from Fort Benning, Georgia. After that, parachuting became for me, I couldn't say that even in almost 300 parachute jumps that I overcame the fears. I learned to deal with the fears. But after that, it was commuter transportation. It was how I went to work. And so when it comes to autonomous vehicles, I see huge possibilities. Governor and I were talking backstage. The saving in lives potentially far outweighs any expense, but we have to convince the people of the great state of North Carolina, this is in your best interest. And so there's no news here. It's just new technology. Some things remain the same, and it'll take good, solid leadership to get people to see this is indeed the way of the future. And your only choice really is get on board. It's okay.
I'd say that in working to convince people that the future is here, maybe yesterday, part of what is really important is respecting that resistance to change is not irrational. It's almost the way human beings are positioned, right? And people are confronting change in their life in every possible dimension, given the kinds of technological, demographic, business model disruptions that are happening every day. And so when you've got an agenda, like a transportation agenda, the challenge is to be able to cut through all of that noise and to help people recognize that the resistance to change isn't going to stop the change from coming.
You know, it's interesting. I was reading something this week, and two things struck me. Between now and 2030, North Carolina will add 2 million people. If we look during that same period of time, there are going to be 4 states in the United States that will basically be responsible for 50% of the population in our country. North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and Texas. Okay, that tells us we're in a different North Carolina than the one that we knew. Anita, you spoke so clearly about how important transportation was in economic development in your opening commentary, but at the same time, I know you spent 10 years of your career leading the Institute for Emerging Issues as well. And part of what I think we do find ourselves in North Carolina today, and more broadly nationally, sometimes it's hard to find consensus. Getting everyone to agree on these things that we know are so important, but in what you've done, at least for a decade of your career, was about building consensus. What lessons can you give us on that?
Sure. Well, I will tell you that when I first started, I thought maybe I could just emulate the magical arm, elbow grab of the chair emeritus of the Institute for Emerging Issues, but it doesn't work for anybody other than Governor Jim Hunt. So we went in another direction. The first thing is it's important to get all the right people in the room at the same time. And one of the things that we often forget when we're doing this kind of intentional engagement strategy is getting the people who have some stake in the future is great, but if you don't get the people who have a stake in the present status quo, you're missing the mark, because those are the people who will torpedo anything that comes out of the process. So you've got to get those people in the room together. You've got to get them to articulate in a very explicit way, so not only does everybody else hear it, but they hear it themselves, like what matters to them. What are the things that they are not going to give up in the resolution of the challenge? And then you want to introduce them to good, credible information. The stuff we saw this morning in the opening session. You sit through a session like that, and you cannot think exactly the same way that you did before you got here. If anybody out there says that's not true, I don't think any differently, check your pulse. You missed something. And then I think finally you have to give people the space and the facilitation techniques that allow them to wrestle through it. I will tell you that for 10 years, we talked about tough issues in transportation, we talked about things in energy, we talked about things in economic development. At the beginning of every one of those processes, people said you will never get these people and these people to agree to a strategy coming out of the process. And every year we got those constituents to agree because it was a well-crafted, intentional strategy. It's possible to do. It's not easy. I don't want to be Pollyanna about it. But the kinds of challenges that we face in North Carolina demand that kind of attention to process.
Thank you so much. General, when you're in the Army, you can do it sometimes by order, but oftentimes you have to build the consensus among troops, among colleagues, among leaders as well.
Well, it's an altruistic statement to say that if you're a military leader, you can't decide what kind of leader you are. The lead will tell you what kind of leader you are. And so that itself more or less implies that you can be totalitarian and you can issue orders. I have done so. But you have to have some consensus. It is contrary to a human's nature to stick that person's head in a dark hole without benefit of flashlight. But if you train them right, and you know, or they know you stand with them, they'll follow you about any place, even into the gates of hell.
Governor Hunt, four terms as governor. Nobody's ever done that. If anybody can build consensus, it's you. What are some lessons you can give us today on how we can find that in today's world?
Well, it's a matter of really caring about what the people want and having imagination about what we can do. Now, we've got a great group of people here today. I'm so impressed that all of these folk, all of you are here, and you all have great talents. You've got great educations, you've had great experiences, you've been around the world. I want to just say that this whole transportation challenge is a huge one for us now. And I believe North Carolina can meet it. We have to know what the technology is capable of and all of that. But then we have to decide whether or not we in North Carolina are going to have a transportation system that can work in light of all the things we've seen and others that are coming along. I believe the answer is that we can do it. First, you need to have the vision of what's involved, what could be involved. And then you have to get out there and have a plan for it. This 2020 group is laying that out for us. We all want to have an input into it. It's our government. And we get to decide whether or not we want to do all of this stuff. I think we do want to do it. I think we're excited about the future. We're not people that sit around and complain and carry on. We believe that we can make this state very special. We can make this country great. We can work with people to do it. We're working together today in a way we never did before. The General and I were talking about growing up in eastern North Carolina. We didn't have African Americans participating then like we do now. And now we have Hispanic folks coming in. And we have people moving from all over the country and all over the world coming here to North Carolina. We're capable of great things, but you have to have visionary leaders who are getting all these new ideas as we're doing today. Then you have to make a plan, as they are doing under Governor Cooper's leadership. The legislature has to be a part of it. The legislature and the governor have to work together. I know something about that. Isn't necessarily easy, but you can do it. But everybody has to be willing to do it. And I hope we'll all encourage everybody to do that. And then we have to have the resources. I know this, maybe you all think I'm thinking of the past a lot. When World War II came along, and Hitler was going to take over the world, and don't you think he wasn't going to do it? He just about had England if we hadn't gone in there to help them. The United States said, what does it take? And of course, Japan hit us, Pearl Harbor. But our people said, what does it take? What are we going to have to do? And we went to work to do it. We can do that on transportation. They've got to develop the plan. It's got to understand all the technology developments that we're hearing here now. And then we have to say, all right, what do we have to do? You all developing the plan. What's it going to take? What kind of resources do we have to put in? And then we, the people, say to the legislature, to the governor, we want to put our resources in there to do that. We want to build that kind of system. And it's got to include light rail transportation or rail across the state. We can do that too. We were one of the first states to have a statewide rail system, the North Carolina Railroad, that we started 150 years ago. And we ought to have light rail across this state. We ought to develop these new and better things. And I want to say one more thing, lest I don't get a chance to say another thing on this panel. My wife, Carolyn, who grew up on a farm in Iowa, is a great driver. She doesn't think I'm a good driver. She doesn't want me to drive, and she's right. She's a good one. And last week, she saved our life. We were coming down Highway 42 between Raleigh and Wilson. And this fool, with a whole line of people coming along, cut right in front of us in a pickup truck. And if she hadn't been a great driver, we'd have been killed. Now, I say that to you all today because the truth is, with these new technologies, and if we have a highway and road system so that we can use those technologies, we can save the lives of people in your family. Think about your parents, your children, your grandchildren. Think about saving their lives with investing in the right kind of transportation and being smart in doing it. So, Madam Mayor, Chairman, I know this is getting off the subject a little bit, but I want to tell you this is involved in transportation, and if we'll invest in it and have the smart plan to do it, we can do it in North Carolina.
Agreed.
Great. Thank you very much, Governor. General McNeil, first of all, thank you very much for your years of service to our nation and for your leadership at Fort Bragg.
Amen. Honor to serve.
Military successes are dependent on a strong, coordinated plan. What factors do you use to determine how to allocate resources among competing needs? And as a follow-up, how are you able to convince your civilian leaders to include the President and Congress when you needed additional resources? We know how he did it.
My techniques might have been somewhat similar.
Might have been similar.
It's a simple lesson in leadership, Mayor, and the basic lesson in leadership is before you're under a stressful requirement to lead, you should have built relationships, not only with those who are to follow you, but those who are to facilitate your forward movement. So I'm thinking about what has been said here today and what Secretary Trogdon has to do, but it occurs to me that I'd probably ask some significant members of the North Carolina legislature to dinner before I'd ask them for money to build this particular road, and then try to take it forward from there. There are also some lessons, not to get too anecdotal here, but some of the hardest problems I had to deal with, I thought about the problem of qualifying with a long rifle on a U.S. Army installation. Some of you have had the experience. You go to a range, you get down in a foxhole, there are an array of targets before you. They're roughly at 25 meters, 50 meters, 100 meters, 150, 200, 250, 300 being the max range. Lesson that you learn first, shoot the 25-meter target when it comes up. It's closest to you, it can do you the most harm. So as I'm thinking my way through, if I were Secretary Trogdon, with what I have to do, that's one of the approaches I would make. But I believe the most important one is before it gets tough, before you're asking for dollars that are not there, yeah, you should have broken a little bread with the people who can give you access to those dollars.
Anita?
Nothing to add.
Follow-up, Governor?
No, but again, it's a matter of what we want in our state, folks. Now, I have the Hunt Institute for Education, Leadership, and Policy. It's at the Terry Sanford School of Government at Duke University. We work with governors and state leaders all over America, especially on education. But we also know what's going on in all these states. I mean, I was recently with former Republican Governor Tom Kean of New Jersey, heading up a group of Hunt Kean Fellows, looking at what's going on in the states. I can tell you, and we ought to be proud of this, I don't believe there's a state in America that has the vision and has the plan and is doing what we're doing here today to get the people to develop the plan for the future, to understand what's in it, and then to commit to doing it. North Carolina is so lucky to have these kind of leaders, to have our great governor, attorney. Listen, I remember when he was in the legislature. What a great leader he was on education and everything else. Grew up in the county next to mine, how much he wanted to see those jobs. He was out there cropping tobacco. And let me tell you, we knew then, now y'all never cropped tobacco, but a few have. But I can tell you, you want a better life. Now, if we want to have that better life for our children and for our families, And if we want to help other people, we need to make sure that we build a transportation system for the future that will serve us well, one that will serve the needs of business and industry. Gosh knows I've been all over the world so many times recruiting industry, bring your companies to North Carolina. We got people that need jobs, and you all have helped prepare the people, and you're among those people that are so attractive. But we now, in today's world and in the future, we're not going to be successful economically. We're not going to get the companies to come. We're not going to develop the entrepreneurs, the new bright people. Used to, we had to bring them in. Now we're developing them. We're not going to have it unless we do the job on transportation. So thank you all for developing this plan. Secretary Trogdon, thank you for your leadership. Legislature, I hope you'll listen to this and be a part of this. You're the leaders too. And let's go out there now and build the kind of system that all over America, these people I work with all over the country, all of them will say, North Carolina's the leader. That's the place that we want to look at, we want to try to emulate, and the companies will want to come here and bring their jobs, and then our children and grandchildren will want to stay in North Carolina because they'll have the jobs here.
Great. Okay, Governor Hunt, I understand that when you were enrolled at NC State, you used to hitchhike 36 hours to visit your future wife. And I know you value the role of public transportation. In fact, you changed NCDOT's hierarchy in 1993 by elevating public transit to a deputy secretary position, and you tripled its budget in 4 years. Last year, we lost the Durham Orange Light Rail project. So what lessons should we take away, and what's your advice to move public transit forward?
Well, that was a shame that we lost that project. We need to figure out a way to do that over again. Now, I understand some concerns at Duke and Durham and so forth, but we're smart enough to do this. We can figure out how to do this. We need to have light rail. We need to have statewide rail. We need to have the highways and the roads and the streets. You got to have that if you're going to have a good economy and have jobs. And by the way, safety. So let's do that. Thank goodness there's a plan underway. We're not in here to say, well, let's develop a plan. They've got a plan. We need now to learn what it is, what it's going to take to carry it through, what kind of resources we've got to get from the legislature to do it, and that means from us the people, and do it. One more thing on going to Iowa to find my wife. I was just off the farm, and I met this pretty girl from Iowa at a national youth conference, farm youth conference. And it was love at first sight. It was. And I remember my sophomore year at State, my, Thanksgiving, Christmas vacation, spring vacation. I never went home. I went to Iowa to see Carolyn Hunt every single time I could, and I got her and brought her back. Thank God for her. So I learned a lot about transportation, how sorry the roads were across America, and I always said, let's us be the best in North Carolina, and that's what we're working on here.
Great, thank you, Governor.
You know, let's pause there for a second, because that was true dedication back and forth to Iowa for all that time. I know you said it was love at first sight. We'll go back to whether it was mutual at some point. But, you know, let's do this for a second, because we have a group of people who have seen this state evolve. We have a group of people who've seen this country evolve. But you've also seen the world. So if we're sitting here today and we think about that presentation we saw this morning, and we see how transportation is going to revolutionize over the next decade, if we're starting with the whiteboard and really thinking about what the transportation infrastructure looks like in North Carolina, sitting here today with a view to what we think it's going to be like in the future, What do you think that transportation network looks like, Anita? Let's start with you, please.
I think our earlier speaker, Tony, articulated it very well when he said, today we think about transportation as a series of assets, and moving forward we'll be thinking about it as services. And to go back for a second to these regional sessions that I had last fall, I was struck that we had these themes, and one of them was infrastructure, but only one region talked about transportation as infrastructure. The transportation conversation actually was much more dominant in the theme of economic mobility. And what people were saying was, for us to become the kind of vibrant North Carolina that Governor Hunt articulates, one where people and places all across the state have an opportunity to meaningfully participate in the fabulous economy we have built and are building, we will need to be sure that we have transportation options. There are times when you do these focus groups and they feel somewhat distant from the reality of the data and the research. And so I think it's really important to recognize here that what these local elected officials and economic developers and regional employers were saying is absolutely consistent with the data. People are surprised when you say the #1 barrier to economic mobility in this country, including in our state, it's not your third grade reading scores. It's not your access to health care. It's not your poverty rates or the housing stock around you. The research is very clear that the #1 barrier to economic mobility nationally are commuter times to work. And so if we're not thinking about how we get people to be able to get to the jobs when employers are struggling to find people to get to the jobs, where they can drop children off at childcare, where they can get to their doctor's appointments, then I think we're not thinking about transportation in a way that propels this state forward.
You know, it's interesting, if we go back 70 years, the Eisenhower interstate system was really born from much of the notions, Governor Hunt, that you've been speaking of. And that is, General Eisenhower, later President Eisenhower, came back and said, we have to find a way to move troops, material, and other goods quickly for our national good. And we've seen that network evolve in so many ways. That was a vision that we had coming out of the Second World War. Again, as we're starting with that whiteboard today and thinking about the vision that you can see for North Carolina going forward, General, what are your thoughts in that respect?
Well, the interstate system, certainly we owe it to President Eisenhower, and by most accounts of history, he got it from seeing the Autobahns in Germany when he was the Supreme Allied Commander. But the truth is, they've always existed in the United States of America. And you knew them as the Oregon Trail and the Santa Fe Trail and a whole bunch of others. It certainly didn't look like a paved interstate, but it was the interstate. It accommodated the technology we had in those days, which was quite simply wagons and horseback. And so I think that part of our message is we began to pull in the preponderance of the citizens of the great state of North Carolina to get some consensus that we're going to have to spend some money, and the money's going to have to come from generating more revenue, that we have to point out this is nothing new. This is, in fact, a natural evolution of things. This change is not extraordinary. And a good example is, I mentioned earlier, the fear that some people will have of being in undriven or driverless, or for that matter, being in an aerial platform and no pilot. There's no news there. If you've flown in an American flag carrier of late on any distance across the 48 contiguous states, most of the time in the cockpit, they're hands off. That technology has been around for many times. It makes the airways a whole lot safer. Just like Tony was making the point this morning, autonomous vehicles will make the roadways a lot safer. So there's a significant amount of messaging. And to go back to most of my adult life, it's not any different to me than convincing a group of American soldiers we're going to train out here in this cold, wet, miserable day because it's what we may have to do when the nation calls upon us. It's that simple.
I'd like to ask this question. Do we know, or are we telling people, if we know, what we're going to have to do in terms of what these streets and highways are going to have to be like in order to use those vehicles?
And I think in large part, that's what we're trying to find out too. That's such a great question, Governor Hunt, because what you raised in one of your comments earlier is in the mid-1970s, you looked and said, we have to have an avenue, a vehicle that'll take us straight from Raleigh to Wilmington. We look at what the history of Wilmington has been since then. Right. And I think part of what this commission is trying to do is sort out how are people going to live, how are they going to travel, how are they going to commute, how far are they going to be willing to commute, and where are they going to get their goods and services. And I think that's something that we're going to spend so much time on over the next several months and weeks. And
it's my point. Yeah. The message that we have for the people of the great state of North Carolina is that we're going to save you money, we're going to save your lives. We have to invest in the infrastructure to support the technology that is within our grasp, not way over the horizon, it's within our grasp.
Let me chase that with you for a second, because in reading your bio, one of the things I love, and you referenced it before, you've made 300 jumps out of perfectly good airplanes.
That's an oxymoron.
I mean, so
there's a lot of contradicting parts in an airplane. It's an oxymoron that they're perfectly good.
So I guess a couple of things. You've talked about most of the time in the cockpit it's hands off. So what I'm assuming is you would feel comfortable flying in an aircraft that is being automatically piloted somehow. I think part of what I'm wondering, how do we get North Carolinians comfortable with the notion that they're likely to be sitting in vehicles, as we saw today, that will not have a driver behind the wheel? And then around that notion, how do we think about how we're going to build this transportation? How do we do that?
I go back to, here's another anecdote. I mean, how many have ever, we call them drones these days, how many of them flew them as a kid? And I'm 73, and the governor might have. I did. But it was on a string. It was the technology for those days. It looked like a P-51 Mustang, and I can still remember on a field on my grandmother's farm going around and around with that thing. It was about 4 years later, and well, maybe 6 or 8 years later. And I'm in Raleigh, and I see my first one that somebody is doing with a remote control device. Mm-hmm. The difference was the technology in those days, it couldn't get out of sight of the operator because that was the link, that was the radio link. Today, they can go and do much further. There's no real news here, and we have to get involved in that kind of messaging. This is a natural evolution, what we're getting into. And nobody should be uncomfortable. As I said, if you've flown anywhere substantial distance in the 48 contiguous states in the last few years, you've been in an airplane that it was hands off. It was being flown by signals more or less from the ground, interacting with things that can interpret and do what it has to do with those signals in the airplane. There's just no real news here.
Interestingly, if I had to fathom a bet, it would be that it will be easier to get North Carolinians to be comfortable with driving in an autonomous vehicle than it will be to get them comfortable with the price tag that it's going to take to put in place the infrastructure to accommodate those vehicles.
So that actually is our next question, is how we know this is going to have quite a price tag on it. How do we convince the citizens of North Carolina on the need for increased investment in our transportation?
We've done it before. Some predecessors of our colleague here put a lot of effort in their time as being governor, father and son, put a lot of effort in their time of being governor of the great state of North Carolina, converting those dirt roads, Frisco Street that was next to my house in Warsaw, North Carolina, in dirt into paved. And The message there was, you will get your crops to market. This will enhance your purse. That message is still consistent, I argue. We'll save you time, we'll save you money, we'll save your lives.
One of my favorite stories about North Carolina is the story of the Research Triangle Park and Archie Davis and people from Winston-Salem who invested disproportionately in the park because even though they were in Winston-Salem, they believed that a successful Research Triangle area would be good for the state and therefore good for them. I don't want to be the Debbie Downer of the group here, but I'm not sure we live in that North Carolina anymore. And as I've been across the state and people have talked about transportation woes, the people who are in the far west are not thinking about what's going on in the southeast. Their issues are what's happening in the southwest. And it feels to me that part of the building support for the investment strategy has to be looking region by region, looking particularly at commuter zones, because that's where the pressure points are in these regions, and really developing a plan where there's something in it for just about everybody. I don't think it's going to work to sell the rest of North Carolina on building infrastructure up in the Triangle or building it in Charlotte.
Well, let me say this to you. I know it's easy to see all of this, and you know how complicated it is and what all might be involved, and wonder whether or not we can do it. First of all, we can do it. Second, our people want us to do it. And they are willing, not only willing, they want to put their resources into it. There's some question today about how much we should put into education. A lot. You got to be smart as a whip. You got to outthink the rest of the world. And if you do, you come up with some of the stuff we're talking about today, plus other good things to save lives and to have a planet we can live on that isn't going to burn up. But our people are aware of that. They're alert. They're smart. They want us to do the right things. They're willing to put their resources into it. I guess if there's one point I guess there are a couple of things I would say here as we're near the end of this. One is, let's get everybody working together on it. Both parties. I remember when we put together the bond issue, the higher education bond issue. Do you all remember that? The political parties, both political parties, officially endorsed it. And it meant putting money into it. It involves getting business leadership. The key to one of the biggest keys to making progress in North Carolina is getting your business leaders, that includes the small businesses too, to get behind things, to support them officially, to say,